Hello, dear comrades! Today, we will continue to look into the basics of the sufficiently general theory of governance. And now, let's look into the term harmonious stability in terms of predictability. Harmonious stability in terms of predictability is the key concept in the sufficiently general theory of governance, which implies object stability in terms of predictability of object behavior to a certain extent under the impact of external environment, internal changes, ruling. As I already said in the previous lecture, you should always keep the scheme of governance in your mind, according to which there always exists a subject of governance, an object of governance. The subject of governance has a ruling informational impact on the object of governance, whether it is a car, a plane, a state, a family, whatever. These are feed-forward lines. And an object under this impact reacts somehow. These are feedback lines. And governance always has a result. Mainstream science does not explore governance of object and stability of object functioning, but they explore sustainability of object functioning in the following sense. In the fields of science and technology, they understand sustainability as the ability of a system, object, to return to its original state after a disturbing effect. Meanwhile, unsustainability is when a system cannot return to its original state after a disturbing effect. The same thing concerns processes. If a process can be turned back into the original state after a disturbing effect, this process is considered to be sustainable. But if it cannot return to its original state after a disturbing effect, this process is considered to be unsustainable. In this picture, we see that after a disturbing effect, the system is diverted from the set course, but then it recovers and returns to the set course. In the second picture, after the disturbing effect, the system cannot return to the set course. All mainstream science follows this definition of sustainability. Speaking of the conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, where the heads of states got together and raised the question on the sustainable development of mankind for the first time, there you can find a lot of useful information. How much fertile land, infertile land, woods, how many starving people, rich people, etc. But what you will never find are answers to the questions. What is the harmonious stability of life on planet Earth? What is the difference between sustainability and harmonious stability? The term sustainable development appeared in the international environment, the majority of languages of which are of Latin origin. In our case, the word sustainable is expressed in the English version of the Latin root. The verb to sustain implies to bear up under, and the adjective sustainable implies bearable, put up with. In other words, the phrase sustainable development does not mean harmonious development or stable harmonious development, but means survivability under the pressure of conditions generated by the dissonance of civilization and objective reality. In essence, the term sustainable development means combat sustainability of human development. In this case, a question arises. Combat against what? Who? The answer to this question is to some extent frustrating. God and creation. But moving in this direction is a real threat, the result of which is already predetermined by the balance of the site's potentials. To put it another way, one cannot go against God. The Quran, Surah 58, Ayat 21 says the same. God has written, I will certainly prevail, I and my messengers. God is strong and mighty. What's more, the conception of sustainable development offered by the UN is imperfect, and in some aspects it is deceitful and erroneous due to the fact that the authors of this conception avoided a direct answer to the questions. What makes a person different from a human with a capital H? What is the difference between today's society and a society of humans with a capital H? How, in the current historical epoch, should those people who are already maturely formed humans treat those who are not yet maturely formed humans? How can we move from the existing, historically formed, global, biospherically, socially, economical given to the norm, civilization of maturely formed humans? As a result of the uncertainty in the answer to the aforementioned questions, since the moment that conception of sustainable development was announced, no ruling consistent, scientific methodological content has been developed for its implementation, not even in the aspect of economic systems in the hierarchy from administratively isolated enterprises operating in the market environment according to the reasoning of its directorate to the global economy. Consequently, higher education institutions have nothing to study on this subject. The conception of sustainable development is expressed in a plurality of different, in the meaning of mutually disconnected, documents, the entire set of which hardly anybody, maybe even nobody, has read. As a result of this, none of today's politicians know this conception as a whole, and unawareness of this conception has not led to the removal of ignorant, incompetent, and weak-minded officials, politicians, and senior managers from their positions in any country in the world who consider themselves to be true democracies. And others who don't regard them as democrats are also occupied by other things, but not solving global issues. As I already said, mainstream science determines sustainability as a slight deviation and an ability to return to the said sustainable course. In the conception of social safety, we raise the question in a different way. Let's look at the historical example of the USSR, when the country was building a bright communistic future for tens of years. We were steadily and stably moving towards this goal. When the country went off the course, the Communist Party returned it to its set course. And every time a diversion would happen, a subsequent course correction by the Communist Party would follow. Later, it turned out that we had reached the wrong goal, not the one we were aspiring to achieve. It turned out we had chosen an erroneous goal. However, we were moving towards that goal sustainably, but not harmoniously, stably. What's more, it took us more than a decade to move towards a so-called bright Marxist future. But in the end, we reached a dead end. Speaking of stability, harmonious stability, Jesus Christ said that man has to live on earth truly happily and with dignity. As one can see, throughout 2000 years, we have been moving towards that happiness, but there has been no happiness. What's more, the true teachings of Jesus Christ are so distorted that it is implied that there can be no happiness on earth at all. Happiness comes only in heaven. So, you, servant of God, listen to your slave masters here on earth, as all power is gifted by God, and there in heaven you will be happy. So, an important thing is what to determine as a goal. Such a position of the Church is essentially a claim to the place of God on earth. In the novel Master and Margarita, written by Russian writer Mikhail Bulgakov, there is a scene where Pontius Pilate asks Yeshua, Why did you, a vagrant, stir up the crowds in the marketplace by talking about truth when you have no conception of what it is? What is truth? Yeshua's reply is really significant in the sense of what he said. The truth is, first of all, that your head aches so badly, in fact, that you are having faint-hearted thoughts about death. Not only are you too weak to talk to me, but you are even having trouble looking at me. That I, at this moment, am your unwilling executioner upsets me. You can't think about anything, and the only thing you want is to call your dog, the only creature, it seems, to whom you are attached. But your sufferings will soon end, and your headache will pass. What does Yeshua speak about in this passage? First of all, there is no abstract truth, nor is there abstract dobro or evil, a topic about which people fruitlessly chatter. Truth, dobro, and evil are concrete phenomena in a particular situation at a certain historical time. What people regard as truth now, tomorrow can be regarded as something else. Before us, there lived people who thought that the earth was flat, located on 3 elephants or whales or a turtle, and floated in the ocean. People used to believe in that truth. Later, it turned out that the earth was spherical, not a pancake, and that everything revolves around the sun. Now, there live people believing in this truth. If you state that you know the absolute truth, that means you lay claims to be God on earth. This is why in the conception we raise the question, what is the meaning of a human life? What is the goal? What is this all for? One can give answers to these questions only for the current historical period. Furthermore, depending on the conditions, one has to correct not only the course, the direction, but also goals themselves. It should be noted that nobody can be a substitute for God. Unfortunately, you will never find this formulation of the question in textbooks or books. The conception of social safety states that in the most generalized sense, the existence of mankind as a whole, as well as every person on earth, is a mastery of the embedded genetically determined potential. But this is in the most generalized sense. Speaking in precise terms, at the current historical stage, every person and mankind as a whole have to get out of the captivity of animalistic instincts and by robotization, and irreversibly become true humans with a capital H. After the achievement of this goal, mankind will face such challenges of the time that one can't even imagine now. I should note that this formulation of the question is set neither by scientists, nor hierarchs of religions, nor politicians. Consequently, stability in terms of predictability is a stability of an object in terms of predictability of its behavior to some extent, under the impact of an external environment, internal changes, and governance. There is no single superfluous or out-of-place word in this formulation. If we draw a picture, it will look like this. All of mankind is an object of governance. The subject of governance towards mankind is the one who rules over mankind, including God. So to say, it is a certain hierarchy. What does, to some extent, mean? This means, in the multi-measured matrix of possible states. This is what we talked about in the 3rd lecture, the Trinity of MIM, matter, information, measure. The staff of Hermes Trismegistus is a symbol of how the ruling of this matrix is carried out. That material, which we have already discussed before, you have to use in practice now, in order to master new material. Objects that do not have a quality of stability in terms of predictability, in fact, cannot be ruled and cannot be introduced into self-governance mode. Here is a simple example from everyday life. There is a driver driving or ruling his car. If he is sober and adequate, he reacts to traffic lights and other factors. Now imagine a drunk driver. His behavior is unpredictable. His next actions are unknown and unpredictable. Or another example from my military service. When I was a regiment commander, I had a low-ranking officer who once got really drunk and decided to chase after kids on a bike. Can you imagine that? He was riding after kids who were just playing around and did not understand what was going on. How can you stop such a guy? Try to stop him. His behavior was unpredictable. Is he governable, rulable in this situation? Of course not. That is why we state that you can rule or govern an object whose behavior after a certain governing impact on it you can predict. In the understanding of stability in terms of predictability, the concepts of objective and subjective come together to form a certain holistic measure of predictability. I have a question. What are considered to be objective and subjective processes? Let's look at this picture. An objective process is a process which flows independently of others. No matter how other processes influence this objective process, it remains unchanged. And this process flows within the boundaries of the highest hierarchical encompassing governance. For instance, globalization is an objective process. Whether we like it or not, this process is underway objectively. In the second picture, we see a subjective process, the flowing of which is determined by the intrusion of certain subjects of governance. One subject exerts one kind of informationally governing impact, and the process flows in a certain direction. Another subject has another informationally governing impact, and the process is shifted in another direction. This is what the concepts of objective and subjective mean. An objective process enters into stability in terms of predictability through the object, environment, and the highest hierarchical encompassing governance, where the highest hierarchical encompassing governance embraces a plurality of particular external governances, which a subject carries out and predicts in an environment. A subjective process enters into stability in terms of predictability through the subject carrying out governance and prognosis of this governance, and through other revealed subjects who can and do exert a governing impact on the object of governance and the first subject, that is to say, through a plurality of particular, revealed external governances. This picture shows an example of anonymous governance. The example is the USSR, which was developing, but in one moment, the USSR collapsed as a result of the implementation of strong maneuver as the final stage of weak maneuver. However, in this vein, scientists, historians, sociologists, political scientists support the point of view that the collapse of the USSR was an objective process. It happened somehow by itself, that empires collapse somehow by themselves. But those who know the hierarchy of governance and understand that there are no processes flowing outside of governance know that the USSR was brought down under the informationally governing impact of the global predictor, the global mafia, as a result of the implementation of the Allen Dulles Doctrine 20/1 from the 18th of August 1948 of the Harvard Project. Through his wife Raisa Maximovna, Gorbachev was told, "You will go down in history. You will turn Russia in another direction. You will be a great reformer." As Gorbachev was under her thumb, he did whatever Raisa Maximovna wanted. As we say in Russian, Mikhail Sergeyevich did what his wife's left heel wanted. But how did she know all that? To understand this, you need to recall that scheme of governance, which demonstrates how all the state leaders, party leaders, and so on are herded. It goes without saying that those who do not understand structural ways of governance, the hierarchy of governance, or the subject-object scheme of governance, for them, the USSR collapsed like all other empires. And this happened objectively. Those who understand all the aforementioned and have these concepts, understandings, integrated in their psyches, that is, have these concepts integrated in the circle of their understandings, realize that everything was deliberately and purposely done according to certain people's designs, that there existed and continue to exist certain goals towards our country. But at the same time, a majority believe that empire collapses appear as unstable processes. Speaking of Ilya Prigozhin and his theory of synergetics, whom we touched upon when looking into mosaic and kaleidoscopic worldviews, he is one of many whose theories are used to form kaleidoscopic views in people's minds. His theory contains a concept of point of bifurcation. This is why many suppose that things like the collapse of the USSR happen objectively. The people were diffusing, then, at a time, reached a bifurcation point and entered a new informational state. A theory like this one implies the fact that a person is deprived of his reason and intellect, as it compares man with molecules. When carrying out governance, one has to be able to distinguish cause-effect relationships. As Kosmoprutkov said, look back more often in order to comprehend and avoid great future mistakes. Gorbachev stated that future sprouts from present. Then I have a question. Where does the present sprout from? Present sprouts from the past. The deeper you look into your past, the more exactly you will understand what will be in your future. For this very reason, in the conception of social safety, history of mankind is viewed only as a small fragment in the global evolution development of the Earth's biosphere. Why? Because from these standpoints, we have to comprehend and avoid great future mistakes in life. So to say, to see cause-effect relationships in the unfolding of events in the biosphere, and mankind is only part of the biosphere. Neglecting all this means rupturing all cause-effect relationships. Here is an example from the political program of one of our politicians, Yuri Mikhailovich Lushkov. It says, "In order to move further along the path of reform, we have to comprehend what has happened with us in the past 10 years. Oh, what a strategist! We have a question to ask him. Where do these past 10 years sprout from? They sprout from Gorbachev's perestroika. Where does Gorbachev's perestroika sprout from? It sprouts from Brezhnev's dementia. Where does Brezhnev's dementia sprout from? It sprouts from Khrushchev's thaw. Where does Khrushchev's thaw sprout from? It sprouts from Stalin's alleged totalitarianism. Where does Stalin's alleged totalitarianism sprout from? It sprouts from Karl Marx and his Marxism. And so on and so forth, until we go back to the times of the ancient Egyptian pseudo-Jratsis. This is why cause and effect relationships are a very important aspect. Let's go back to that word formula set by Alexander Pushkin. Providence is not algebra. The human mind, as the folk expression goes, is not a prophet but a conjecturer. It sees the general course of things and can deduce from it profound suppositions, often justified by time. But it cannot foresee chance, that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence. What is the general cause of things, according to Pushkin? This is cause and effect relationships. What are cause and effect relationships? A subject can predict, on the basis of his own subjective interpretations of objective cause-effect relationships. To put it another way, there is a process which has causes and conditions in which this process flows. And every process proceeding from this cause and condition has an effect, consequence. Accordingly, the same causes under the same conditions generate the same effects, consequences. Knowing all this enables one to predict, foresee, and act consciously. If a person understands and integrates all this into the circle of his concepts, understandings, he can predict, foresee, and consciously act in his life. Here is an everyday life example from Russia. You are at a wedding. Being experienced in life, you are observing the young couple and notice that the groom drinks too much and his bride is making eyes at other men. And you therefore realize that they won't make a happy family. Why do you think so? Because you understand causes and conditions that generate certain effects, consequences. What can you do in a situation like this? Are those effects inevitable? Of course not. If you, for some reasons, see and want to change the flow of this process, you have to intrude into the governance of this process and exert a relevant governing informational impact on the groom and his bride. How can you do it? You can say it bluntly. Are you idiots? Don't you understand where you are going to end up? Or you can have a structuralist impact, saying it not openly but hinting in some way. Over time, this couple can pay attention to your words and change their direction of movement. In this case, one has to be truly dobrous, gentle, and considerate. The same concerns the relationships between a husband and a wife. For instance, if a wife doesn't like her husband's tie, she can say it openly. Ivan, I don't like your tie. Then, in this case, as her husband is very proud, he can react by saying, leave me in peace, stop telling me what to do. Or she can say it in a different way. For example, you know, darling, I saw Alain Delon with a very nice tie in a movie. I think that tie would suit you well. In other words, she doesn't say it openly. Never wear this terrible tie. But anyway, she exerts such a governing influence on her husband that the possibility that he will wear the tie she wants him to wear is significantly higher. Although these examples are banal, I suppose the viewers have comprehended the essence. The same principles operate on a state level. If you observe a flow of process in politics, then, if you correctly determine the factors which influence this process flow, you can predict the further direction of this or that process. If you know history well, you can see how the same matrices take place in different historically political times. But sameness of cause and effect relationships is perceived as unambiguousness of relevant events, but not as a probabilistic statistical predetermination describing an aggregate plurality of events. Therefore, the factors influencing the change of statistics fall out of sight of an ordinary consciousness, and subjectivism of interpretations of objective patterns is forgotten. Further on, let's talk about unpredictability. Let's look at an example with Russia again. It was first on its own political course. Then, boom bang, it was collapsed, the USSR. We were rolled down, so to say, along the currency's steep slope. The ruble as a currency was pulled down, as a result of which the country is still going down. The birth rate and so on is going down. People are getting poorer, but the death rate is climbing. And again, what do our scientists do? They state it is an ungoverned, unruled chaos. So we have to wait for the bifurcation point to turn up. Again, there is a hint that everything just turned out this way and will change somehow by itself. But if they knew the hierarchy of governance, the theory of governance, they would notice that all processes are ruled, organized, and orchestrated by certain forces. This is why, very often, what is unpredictable is perceived by many as a spontaneous phenomenon. But at the same time, others find the same phenomenon predictable and rulable, probably anonymously. Therefore, we need to recall our unforgettable Kosma Petrov, who said, "Many things we do not understand not because our understandings, concepts are weak, but because these things are not integrated in the conceptual circle of our understandings, concepts," which corresponds to a children's Russian song. Dilly dilly trolley valley, this I never learned to do. They didn't teach us in our school. As for ruling over countries, we know that there exists internal politics. Internal politics is a policy carried out towards one's own country. There also exists external politics, which is a policy carried out towards other countries and nations. All this is well known and comprehended by everyone. Now, I will tell you two new words: global politics. This is a policy carried out towards all mankind on planet Earth. So, if leaders of states and countries, whatever they are, czars, monarchs, general secretaries, presidents, etc., if they do not know ways and methods of the conduct of global politics, they become hostages of those who do know and understand all this. What are these ways and methods of global politics like? They are structureless methods of governance, which exert such an informationally governing impact under which people will act in a probabilistically predetermined way, the way it is needed. So, the credit financial system is a powerful weapon for structureless governance over countries and nations. The one who announces financial economic forecasts spreads the necessary overruling nature information all over the world. Today, this is a Hungarian Jew named George Soros. He carries out the task entrusted to him by the global predictor of spreading such rumors. And many buy such things, thanks to the authoritative image of this announcer. Loss of stability in terms of predictability can be in an object itself, in an environment, in the subject who rules and predicts. To understand this, we can go back to the example with a plane. Imagine a plane flying. One of its wings falls off. As a result of this, control ruling over this plane becomes impossible. So to say, the ruling process over this plane has a loss of stability in terms of predictability. The environment can also disrupt the stability in terms of predictability. For instance, a fog, a wind, lightning, etc. The subject of governance can also be a cause of loss of stability in terms of predictability. This can be caused by narcotic and psychotropic substances of different kinds, alcohol, exhaustion, psychic disorders, and so forth. A loss of stability can be sudden and gradual. I'd like to note that rulers at any level must know all these things I say on the sufficiently general theory of governance. Everyone must know all this. Anyone, businessmen, politicians, and so on. The same object can be stable and unstable. Stable according to some parameters, unstable according to other parameters. For instance, a vehicle. The parameter of gasoline storage is a stable factor, as a driver can see how much gasoline he has left and when he has to go to the gas station. As for a sudden puncture of a tire, it is an unpredictable parameter. If a puncture happens, stability in terms of predictability is reduced. In order to increase the stability, the driver has to have a spare wheel in case of a loss of the stability, so that he can restore it. What's more, an object can be stable on the basis of internal information and unstable on the basis of external information. For instance, a person can be stable on the basis of his internal information. He can be calm, tranquil. But if someone says something unpleasant to him, he can lose stability on the basis of external information aimed at him. What conclusion can we make here? The one who rules has to stay focused, be able to act in any situations, and also have the high stability. He has to be able to be in the right, emotionally meaningful state, tuning, independent of conditions, no matter how hard the situation is, no matter what external and unfavorable factors are impacting this ruler. If it is easy to upset this ruler easily becomes rulable. Self-mastery and calmness are very important qualities for a ruler. The necessary measure of stability in terms of predictability is determined, on one hand, objectively in the previously established situation, object plus environment, which a subject cannot change. On the other hand, subjectively, through one's feeling, premonition towards objectivity. For instance, a runway is usually 1 kilometer long. It is a standard length for safe takeoffs and landings. But the situation is definitely different if the runway is only 100 meters long on board an aircraft carrier. Long ago, in Crimea, in the times of the USSR, there was a military base where pilots trained to land on board aircraft carriers. A pilot, through his own subjective feeling, premonition, had to understand how to conduct a landing. Otherwise, one cannot serve as a pilot on an aircraft carrier. This is why, in this field, there is a high dropout rate, because a pilot also has to endure a heavy workload that not everyone can withstand. Because to successfully conduct a landing in such restricted conditions, one must be truly masterful. A pilot must also be highly professional with great skills. So, in this case, everything depends on a pilot's subjective qualities. Stability in terms of predictability concerning anything is the only indication of objective consistency, adequateness, of a ruler's subjective perception of anything operating in an environment. This indication reveals, proves, solves, and crystallizes objective adequateness, consistency of any subjective philosophy. In essence, it is an answer of life to the question of whether we are going in the right direction, whether we have correctly chosen the goals, and only the criterion of previousness and unpreviousness can indicate the stability of this process. For instance, how can you understand through stability in terms of predictability whether you talk to God or something else? In one of our former lectures, I said that any person can enter into a dialogue with God. A person gets answers immediately. And one of the ways of moving these answers onto the level of consciousness is through dreams. But there are also other ways of doing this. I told you about that before. It is when your brain, consciousness and subconsciousness is in the state between awake and asleep. You should linger in this half-asleep state. How can you do that? You should stay in bed with your eyes closed in order to keep your brain asleep, so to say, not to let it fully wake up. Images should come to you. After that, you should correlate the problem you have with the images you get in your dreams. How can you understand whether you talk to God or something else? So, you get a prompt, you use it in your life. And if everything goes well, that means that prompt came from God. In a while, for instance, you come up with another problem. You ask God for help one more time. A prompt comes to you. You use it in life. Everything goes well and stable again. Then for the third time, for the fourth time, you appeal to God again and again. If everything goes well, that means you are on the right way. You decode prompts in the correct way. But if something goes fine and then wrong, either you might decode prompts erroneously, or you might talk to something other than God. There is nothing tricky here. You have just to be able to see the common cause of things. Stability is a criterion, right or wrong, previous or unprevious. And this aforementioned indication reveals objective adequateness, consistency of any subjective philosophy. Any opinion, guess, theory, ideology is resolved with the help of stability in terms of predictability. And the longer the time interval of the cause-effect relationships you explore is, the more exact the result you will get. Exploring a process within a short interval of time, the possibility of error is one thing. But within a long interval of time, the possibility of error is another thing. The longer the interval of time you explore a process within, the lower the possibility of error. From these very standpoints, we, in the conception of social safety, looked into the global historical process within the boundaries of the global evolution process of Earth's biosphere, in order to minimize our possible errors when taking decisions on the future conception of life. Man has his senses: hearing, eyesight, taste, touch, smell. But the most important thing is that man has the so-called sixth sense, the sense of measure. A person through his biofield can perceive all processes holistically and at once. But he cannot at once move them all onto the level of consciousness. In this picture, you can see an attempt to schematically depict the sixth sense, the sense of measure, and connect it to stability in terms of predictability. On top, we see a multi-measured matrix of possible states. It is the pan-universal matrix. And here we see man. He has consciousness, subconsciousness, intellect, the sense of measure. Subconsciously, man is connected with the pan-universal measure, so to say, through the interaction of his biofield and oscillatory processes in the universe. He perceives, receives all information holistically and at once. Therefore, the conscious knowledge of cause-effect relationships in the cycle system of governance, object, subject, environment, feed-forward lines, feedback lines, results. So, if a person really comprehends this and has it integrated in the conceptual circle of his concepts, understandings, then man, thanks to the mastery of the scheme of governance, with the help of his intellect through the sense of measure, can move this all onto the level of consciousness. The core of the sense of measure is stability in terms of predictability. Therefore, the sense of measure is an individual sense, like eyesight. Some people have perfect eyesight, but some don't. Some people can even see biofields, but many can't. Speaking of animals, by the way, cats and dogs can see biofields. This is why they often lie next to that part of your body where you have a disruption of your biofield. By the way, many clairvoyants can also see biofields. But Extrasensorically seeing is one thing, and understanding is completely another one. That is why we state that if clairvoyants could clearly understand what they can clearly see, that would be priceless. For this reason, the sense of measure is only an individual sense along with the other senses. During my life, I have even met a person with an extrasensory level of smell. That is, he really had the nose of a wolf. He could smell another person from 30 meters away and identify by smell who was coming. The sense of measure, one's personal sense, must go together with knowledge. Information mastered by the culture of society must be consciously comprehended by each and every individual. One must not oppose the sense of measure to mastered knowledge, the same as one does not oppose the other senses to knowledge: eyesight, hearing, smell, touch, taste. So, knowledge is one thing, but the sense of measure is another. The sense of measure must be developed from childhood. If people don't have a concept, understanding, that man can perceive all of creation at once through his biofield, then all this does not exist for them. All this is out of the question for them. Consequently, they take it as nonsense, as this is not integrated in the conceptual circle of their concepts, understandings. In the next picture, we see psyche types. Before, we mentioned that man has instincts, conditional and unconditional reflexes. He also has automations and habits that form throughout his life. Man also has intellect and intuition. The latter is an aggregate of voices coming to man from creation through his biofield. But among all these voices, there is one specific one coming from the Creator, which in the Russian language is named Совесть. That which is dominant in man's behavior determines man's psyche type. If man's intellect denies intuition, if he doesn't follow it and serves only his instincts, conditional and unconditional, this is the animal psyche type. He seems to be man, but is actually guided by animalistic instincts, to eat, to have sex, etc. His behavior corresponds to the following words in Russian. It is good to be a cat. It is good to be a dog. You can pee and poo where it pleases you. Very often, this algorithmics appears in the guise of a very fine-looking cultural shell in a veiled form, as a result of which a person cannot see the true essence of his behavioral algorithmics in such a quality. If man's intellect serves habits and automations, which he acquires throughout his life, if he follows them thoughtlessly, being deprived of will, and if he's only focused on things that restrict his horizon, this is the zombie psyche type. Such people follow certain set programs installed in their psyches. Their intellects serve their stereotypes and habitual behavior. This psyche type often manifests in the thoughtless following of traditions, habits, cultural and religious automatisms, when a person doesn't ask himself questions on the goal orienting of the thoughtless following of all those automatisms about their inner essence. If man's intellect denies the voice of intuition, but skillfully masters unconditional and conditional reflexes and instincts, he is exalted in his intellect, his willpower. This is called the demonic psyche type. But a person proves himself a true human only provided that he subjugates his will to the dictatorship of his совесть in all cases with no exceptions at all. And the sense of measure is really important and necessary in this case. There is also the fifth psyche type, lower than the animal type. In our society, there are some people who shouldn't be compared to animals. Animals behave much better than they do. These people are those who drink alcohol, take various drugs. They have nothing in common even with animals. Thus, these people break their natural physiology and generate another one, which cannot exist in nature. In this sense, these people are worse than animals. Man becomes a true human with a capital H only when he develops his sense of measure, subjugates his willpower to the dictatorship of his sophists, and on this basis he enters into coherence with the Creator. Now, let's look into probabilistic predetermination. In the picture, we see the Russian letter Z. Aside from some Slavic languages, this letter does not exist in other languages of the world. Letter Z shows us how the past through the present moves into the future. Look, the past is also multivariant, as the past was once the future. A plurality of variants in their aggregate conditions a single variant being implemented in the present. All these variants go to one present variant. The present is always single variant, after which a multivariant future sprouts. It is significant that letter Z is the first one for the word life, жизнь, in the Russian language. Now, let's correlate this with the law of normal distribution. Before, I gave you a few examples of this when I was talking about different tests on pencils and people concerning bravery, greed, and so on. It is when 5 to 10% of pencils, for instance, are of good quality and 5 to 10% are of bad quality. They are so-called tails of distribution. Whereas the bulk have average characteristics, so to say they correspond to the norm. Unlike other things, people being tested can change this or that way. They can change this nomogram, tails of distribution. For instance, one tail of distribution shows the number of the most clever people, let's say 5 to 10%, and the other tail of distribution shows us a number of the most stupid people, let's say 5 to 10% too. The remaining 80 to 90% are on average clever people. But if we influence people, the nomogram can change. Those who are of average intelligence will be in the tail of distribution in the number of 5 to 10%. Meanwhile, in the other tail of distribution, a new group of people will emerge, which previously did not exist. These are 5 to 10% of even higher intelligence in relation to those who, in the changed nomogram, are considered average. So, this nomogram can move to the side of priviousness or to the opposite, unpriviousness. In many languages, the right is associated with righteousness and the left with unrighteousness. If we correlate all this with letter Z, we will see the following. We, from the flow of the past processes and possibilities, come to the present and stand before multivariant choice of future. If we don't do anything, nothing will change. Tomorrow will be the same as today. Although the previous life arrangement, where the human psyche type dominates, looks unlikely, less probable, but it does objectively exist. One has to exert more effort to implement it in life. The future sprouts from the past through the present. In order to move this nomogram towards priviousness, you have to put more effort into it. What does probabilistic predetermination mean? It is one of the facets of the sense of measure. Perception and comparison of probabilistic predeterminations of different possible variants of future. Probabilistic predetermination of future in general is always equal to 1. Meanwhile, a probabilistic realization of the certain variant of future is always equal to less than 1. To put it another way, the fact that future will come is equal to 1. But the fact that a certain desired variant of future will be realized is always equal to less than 1. Life is practice of realization, implementation of probabilistic predeterminations. Probability theory and mathematical statistics are an idealized model, as the human aspect, the aspect of a personality, falls out of probability theory and mathematical statistics, which excludes subjectivism of governance. Only figures of results, certain numbers, are important in probability theory and mathematical statistics, but not who rules and how. We already know that there is the entire function of governance, which means that the process of realization of probabilistic predeterminations in practice is always specific and involves the aspect of a personality, and thus gives the process individual uniqueness and originality. In other words, the entire function of governance implies a process of creativity. And every personality carries a possibility and impossibility of implementation of this or that event development. Today, we have such people in Russia who, from their pessimistic sentiments, follow the position: Russia is gone, no one can save it, all the money flows into the hands of the mafias, and they give up, kneel down, go on a binge, and so on. The probabilistic predetermination of the realization of an event implies a personal, subjective aspect and a personless probability of an event multiplied by a ruler's personality as a carrier of certain probabilities. The conclusion is that a probabilistic predetermination is always wider than a probabilistic event implementation. From these standpoints, let's have a look at Stalin again. Stalin came to power in a devastated, destroyed country after Lenin's reign. However, Stalin left behind superpower number 1 or 2. It depends on how you look at the things. His name, however, is totally slandered. Everything that is known about him fits into the single mantra: Stalin, bury a gulag. Stalin, bury a gulag. Hardly anybody knows that the only personal belongings left behind by Stalin after his death were 2 suits, one for everyday occasions and the other one for special occasions, along with some other things I mentioned before. He left behind neither villas nor other attributes of luxury. Stalin worked from morning to night without interruption. He knew all the design engineers by name. He did his best, his utmost for the country, and the country was prosperous, flourishing, thriving. And now it is these villainous officials who are flourishing. They tore the country apart, destroyed it, and live in luxury, while the country lays in disaster and ruins. I think it is obvious for everyone. You see the difference? However, these subhuman scum, our officials, suppose that they have the moral right to slander and sling mud at Stalin's name. What I mean to say by this example is that a lot depends on a personality. When someone says, "What can I do by myself?" If you are man with a capital M, if you have true knowledge, a true philosophically worldview basis, if you strictly subordinate your willpower to your sophist in all situations with no exceptions, in this case, there is a lot you can do, not only in your life, but also in the life of your family, city, country, and all mankind. You can do a lot if you exert a necessary informational impact on the hearts and minds of people. The next concept that we will look into is the measure of non-determination. Probabilistic predetermination of a certain particularity is just a fragment in the statistical predetermination of being of all particularities in the entire creation. Probability theory in its essence is a theory of measures of non-determinations for the implementation of a single determined variant from a definite plurality of variants. In this picture, we can see processes. The green one is a current process of governance, and it is moved. That means a certain maneuver is being completed from one particular state, the balancing mode, into another particular mode or state. Among that plurality of variants, in this picture, we demonstrate only 5 as an example. In fact, there exists a huge number of such variants. So, we choose only one of the variants, and our process goes well. Also, we have to take into consideration that nearby there are other processes ongoing. As an example, let's take 2 of them. These processes have their impacts on the flow of our process of governance. The red process exerts its specific impact on our process, as does the blue one. Consequently, in order to act correctly, we have to understand that these processes influence our process of governance. If looking into a certain process, you brush aside parallel processes influencing this process, saying something like, "It is impossible, I don't believe it, I don't want to hear it," and the like. But this does not mean that parallel processes do not exist. Parallel processes do exist, and they influence your process, which means that ignoring them will lead you to unexpected consequences. Therefore, a qualified ruler always tries to take parallel processes in his activity into account. For example, a person wants to build a paper-producing factory. He should take into account that his factory will be under the impact of the availability of raw material, the financial credit system, which is of a global nature and depends on the decisions and reasoning of those who determine the parity of currencies. But there are also many other processes that he should take into consideration. But many people, especially businessmen, believe that they have no time to deal with what I'm saying here. They say that time is money, so they make dough, make hay while the sun shines. The same concerns Russian businessmen, who can't understand where Kirienko's default came from. Do you think it was Kirienko who organized it? Of course not. It was caused by a crisis of the global financial credit system, as a result of which 300,000 Muscovite businessmen who regarded themselves as successful, who thought that they knew everything in their field, lost their businesses at once. And many of them began to drink from grief. Do you think they lost everything because they were fools in their field? No, it happened because they didn't take into consideration all the aforementioned, as they preferred to get while the going was good. All this simply didn't exist for them because they had to make their killing now. They didn't want to integrate this into the conceptual circle of their understandings, concepts. I want to remind you that everyone, according to the measure of his understanding, works for himself, but according to the measure of his non-understanding, he works for those who know and understand more. For people like those businessmen, global politics is a myth which only idiots can buy. History for them is an unruled process which unfolds somehow by itself. One should also remember that if something happens, it is of use to someone, even if this someone is not visible and is not a human at all. Therefore, there are no coincidences. Remember that there are always processes ongoing parallel to your own processes, and you should understand how they influence your processes. By the way, speaking of scientists, they don't look at processes like this. Why? Because they suffer from kaleidoscopic idiocy. As we say in Russian, physicists know physics, lyricists know lyrics. The physicists symbolize sciences, and lyricists symbolize humanities. This Russian saying means that everybody is confined to their narrow specialization, but no one possesses holistic knowledge. They possess knowledge concerning their specific field only. I know what I have to know in my job, they say, and that's it. Politicians are the same as scientists. For example, they are not interested in the fact that religions actually rule society. They believe that religion and politics are two separate things, existing on their own. The fact that religion influences, rules millions of people, and determines their behavior is ignored. Different religions determine people's behavior in different ways. However, politicians believe that religions do not concern them. What's more, some idiots officials in our country state that they stay away from politics. This is an example of kaleidoscopic idiocy. Speaking in general terms, every particular measure comes into contact with a plurality of other particular measures. All this means that the lower the probability of implementation of the chosen variant is, the higher the quality of governance in the transitional process, and the higher the qualification of a ruler according to the entire function of governance must be. In this picture, we again see the letter Z. Here is the law of normal distribution, the probability of event implementation. The probability that tomorrow will be the same as yesterday is very high, and the probability of event X is quite low. In order to move the process in the desired direction, high quality of governance and high qualification of a ruler who acts according to the entire function of governance are essential. Now, let's talk about variance of the future. If the probabilistic predetermination of the future is equal to 1, but the content of this future is not yet determined, in this case, this given condition is equivalent to the picture where on one end of the scale there is the future in general, but on the other end there is a plurality of variants of future, red pebbles, and every pebble has its own probability and its own weight, and every variant has its own measure of probability from 0 to 1. These variants can be mutually exclusive, mutually complementary, fragments of other variants, following one another sequentially. In this case, their mutual influence can vary. The universe is hierarchical. Consequently, the probabilistic predetermination of the future is equal to 1 and distributed in relation with variance, hierarchy of vectors of possible states in every one of the variants according to the subjective perception by subjects of the universe hierarchy as objective reality. This distribution concerning variance alters according to the measure of development of situation. Therefore, there has to be a creative approach to every situation based on the fact that everything flows and changes. And the dynamics of changes of events in life have to be monitored in order to comprehend that these changes exert a certain impact on the process which you are ruling. There can be errors when estimating probabilistic predeterminations, which can arise due to inadequate perception by a subject of variants that he determined himself, as well as their sequence, one after another, according to the measure of development. If a person violates the order of achievement of his goal, in some cases, he can bring the whole process to a collapse. But a person is liable to make mistakes. This is why he, due to his restricted world perception, does not perceive the exact meaning that the probabilistic predetermination is equal to 1. A person perceives this as a figure less than 1. This number, less than 1, man regards as the exact value and forgets that this approximate figure contains a certain error. However, the degree of these errors differs. This also concerns man's evaluation of the future in general, as well as every particular variant. Probabilistic predeterminations of every variant differ, but the common probabilistic predetermination of the entire plurality of variants is the value which is always less than 1, as some variants, due to subjectivism, fall out of view of a subject. This means that the probabilistic predetermination of the entire plurality of variants plus an error of subjectivism together make it equal to 1. Non-determinations in processes of governance correspond to either an error of governance or a miracle. Depending on what exactly falls out of a subject's view and perception, the sense of measure in fact gives a perception of the entire plurality of variants of future, a perception of predetermination of every one of these variants. However, man can be mistaken in the perception of description of variants of vector of possible states, and in the perception of probabilistic predeterminations of every one of these variants. Concerning social processes, Russian historian Vasily Osipovich Kluchevsky said the following: "The pattern of historical phenomenon is inversely proportional to its spirituality, that is, nraviousness. We already know that in crowd elite society, a majority of people's nraviousness, relatively speaking, is equal to 0. The entire history of crowd elite society is an old record that plays again and again. However, the perception of variance of very little probabilistic implementation plus stable governance in transitional processes leading to these variants can incredibly transform the world. But such nraviousness is conditioned by a ruler's high spirituality, his personal sense of measure. In order to exclude this very slight probability, the Talmud contains the following expression: even the best of the Goyim should all be killed. By the word Goyim, non-Jews or Gentiles are meant. So, when people emerge who aspire to change people's lives and change the conception of governance, then in this case, the Talmud destroys the growing spirituality of society in the infancy of this process. Speaking of the Talmud, it contains some other very interesting phrases. The Goyim are not humans, they are beasts. If you eat with a Goy, it is the same as eating with a dog. Sexual intercourse between the Goyim is like intercourse between animals. When it comes to a Gentile in peace times, one may harm him indirectly, for instance, by removing a ladder after he had fallen into a crevice. If a Goy, Gentile, hits a Jew, he must be killed. If a Jew finds an object lost by a Goy, it does not have to be returned. If a Jew murders a Goy, there will be no death penalty. What a Jew steals from a Goy, he may keep. Jews may use subterfuges to circumvent a Goy. All children of the Goyim are animals. Girls born of the Goyim are in a state of nidach, menstrual uncleanness, from birth. Yeshua is in hell being boiled in hot excrement. Yeshua is an acronym for the Jewish curse. May his, Jesus' name, be wiped out forevermore. Yeshua was sexually immoral and worshipped a brick. Yeshua was cut off from the Jewish people for his wickedness and refused to repent. Miriam, the hairdresser, had sex with many men. She, who was the descendant of princes and governors, played the harlot with carpenters. Christians who reject the Talmud will go to hell and be punished there for all generations. Now, let's look into the concepts of prophet and prophecy, forecast and programming, and their differences. Let's formalize the process of prophecy. So, here is a single, not mass, phenomenon. That is a process which has certain causes and conditions of the flow. Accordingly, the flow of this process has certain consequences. This is a description of one phenomenon. Now, let's talk about a mass phenomenon. Imagine that there are different processes, one process, another one, and so on. So to say, a plurality of processes. Every one of them has certain causes and conditions of the flow, and every process has certain consequences. All this is explained in the following way. The same causes in the same conditions lead to the same consequences, which create common statistics. Sameness of consequences determines the statistical predetermination. If man can analyze events, looking at them from the standpoint of the highest hierarchical level, knowing the statistics of the past, knowing density of distribution of probabilities, having the sense of the pan-universal measure towards the unknown, then man can prophesy the future with varying degrees of accuracy and remove the unwanted from the future according to his will, but within the boundaries of God's allowance. The initial data for all this is the following statement, which says, life is practice of definite implementation of plurality of probabilistic predeterminations. That is, there exists a plurality of variants, but there is a need to realize only one of them. Mathematical probability theory and mathematical statistics is an idealized model that does not include subjective governance or especially the highest hierarchical encompassing governance. Therefore, the process of governance of these probabilistic predeterminations is always specific, concrete. As the entire function of governance exists, this process always has a personal aspect, an aspect of a personality, which vests the process of governance of probabilistic predeterminations with individual uniqueness and distinctive originality. We already know that probability theory and mathematical statistics are blind to the personal aspect of governance. But an individual has the sense of distinction when making a choice. Do this or do that, within the boundaries of his subjective understanding of what is probable and what is not. Let's say it again that in the tasks of governance, according to the entire function of governance, the probabilistic predetermination of event implementation is a mathematical probability of this event self-implementation multiplied by a ruler's personality as a carrier of certain probabilities. The mathematical probability of event self-implementation is personless, but the probabilistic predetermination of the event contains an aspect of a personality and a personality specificity, concreteness. If statistical patterns are unalterable or alter slowly, they can be used for prediction, that is to say, describe variants of the future. Then, in this case, the mathematical probability of every variant is a measure of non-determination in the process development as a whole in general. In other words, probability theory would be more aptly named theory of measures of non-determinations, that is, probability theory in real life. Now, let's talk about God's design and how we should relate to it. In this picture, we see a person restricted by a certain threshold of sensitivity. That means we, people, cannot perceive, embrace everything. Not everything is in the realm of our power, as we are not equal to the Creator in terms of power. We are just like Him in the image of God. Beyond the boundaries of this threshold of sensitivity, man cannot perceive or embrace. This is beyond the boundaries of man's senses. This is what we name God's designs, providence, or the highest hierarchical encompassing governance in relation to man. And the highest hierarchical encompassing governance can overturn all present ideas about possible scenarios for the development of events. Alexander Pushkin said a great thing on this. Let's recall it again. Providence is not algebra. The human mind, as the folk expression goes, is not a prophet but a conjecturer. It sees the general cause of things and can deduce from it profound suppositions, often justified by time. But it cannot foresee chance, that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence. It is true that a person sees the general cause of things, statistics, and other things that we have already looked into. But it cannot foresee chance, that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence. Why so? Because the Creator, the highest hierarchical encompassing governance, represents the highest governance towards every single person and mankind as a whole, and when necessary, He shows His hand in the course of events. Let's look at a concrete historical example of Russia. As I told you before, Lenin prevented the revolution from spreading by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He was therefore eliminated through his wife, Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya. According to the agenda of the global predictor, Lev Bronstein, by the nickname of Trotsky, was supposed to carry on the permanent global revolution. But it cannot foresee chance, that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence. Trotsky, a fiery revolutionist and the author of the permanent revolution, fell badly ill and was unable to rule Russia. As a result of that, Stalin intercepted the governance of the country. This is that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence, which is beyond what man usually understands. You should also understand that if God shows His hand in processes, it happens for a reason, and it is always corresponded to His design and includes the entire function of governance. After all, the Creator has a plan for us, and if He sees that we need help, He shows His hand. He gives hand to those whose activity lies within the boundaries of His design, although those people may be unaware of the fact that God is infinitely merciful and forgiving. But His providential governance lies within the realm of less probabilistic implementation. This is that very powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence, which can show up in a situation where the implementation of a certain variant, which corresponds to God's design, is very low. Why so? Because the Creator gifted us with great freedom and free will. Here is the conclusion. People, do all that is possible. What you cannot do will be done by God. There are people under the governance of whom every undertaking perishes. These we name rulers of destruction. But there are people under the governance of whom the impossible is performed. It is appropriate to recall Stalin's thesis, which says, personnel determine everything. People determine everything. What's more, there are people who distinguish the first type of people from the second, so to say, between those who can actually rule and those who cannot. I remember when I was a young lieutenant, my commander at that time, named Kozlov, asked, before writing a character report on me, "What do you want me to write in this report, Lieutenant Petrov?" "I don't know, write what you think is necessary," I answered, as I was young and green. Then he hemmed and said, You shouldn't say so. I can write a good attestation for you, but below I can write some shit, and this shit will be stinking for the rest of your life. I should note that people are judged by attestations, what they wrote about you, what label they stamped you with, and so you walk with this for the rest of your life. All this tacitly implies that people do not change, but people can change in the course of life. One should take this into consideration at all times, especially when appointing someone to a position. In reality, many don't take this all into consideration when appointing personnel. They don't suppose that people can change. By the way, speaking of primitive societies, alleged wild people, there were shamans there who noticed and singled out children capable of governance. During our discussion on genetics, we said that man's individual psychic architecture is shaped and stabilized to some extent by the age of 10 to 12 years. And then some things can be changed, but some things are difficult to change. So shamans detected capable boys by evaluating their spiritual maturity at the age of 7 to 14. There is such a book, Primitive Culture, written by Edward Bernard Tyler. In Primitive Culture, people reasoned more seriously about appointing someone than we do today. They evaluated the capability of personnel appointed for governance. In today's crowd-elite society, the elites only want to have their own people appointed. They are interested only in who of their family will rule, but not how. When someone is appointed, they just look at what clan this or that candidate belongs to, but not his abilities and skills. The algorithm of friend or foe works in their psyche. Meanwhile, for society, it is important how they rule, with what quality, and according to what rules conception. Now, let's talk about the fact that a forecast is governance. Forecast in itself is an implementation of governance. For instance, astrological forecasts. Astrology is a science on energetic informational rhythms of interactions of the cosmos, the earth, the biosphere, mankind. Announcing an astrological forecast implies, by default, the absence of a ruling reaction among those to whom it is addressed, which means there will be no possibility of governance. To put it another way, in its essence, an astrological forecast by default implies the behavioral line of people the way it is needed, wanted. But this is not openly stated in forecasts. I already told you that the passing of any information is an act of governance. A person can react to this information differently. He can correlate his actions, plans, goals, etc. with the received information, or the opposite. But an act of passing information is an act of governance, including astrological forecasts. However, astrologers deny the fact that they have a governing impact on people, the fact that they are actually rulers. So, actually, these defaults program man's psyche that the forecast is inevitable. This is one of the methods of governance towards the thoughtless crowd. In the KOB, in the conception of social safety, we state that astrology has to be returned to the field of exact sciences in order to be used in people's lives, as astrology is factually an exact science. What we have now is not astrology, but something closer to quackery, shamanism, and so on. A person reacts to an astrological forecast according to his nervously conditioned spirituality. Viewers may want to ask me how you should react to forecasts. You should react to them in the following way. Do forecasts have the right to exist? Yes, they do. So you should listen to them, and then, based on your understanding, You act according to the circumstances. There is no need to brush aside forecasts with reactions like, I believe, I don't believe. There is no need to try to forget it, but it is necessary to try to understand what nervousness this forecast contains. A forecast corresponds to a person's real nervousness. If the person changes his nervousness, the forecast can change too, or it will never come to be. You shouldn't be scared of forecasts, but you should use them for your blaga, as an astrological forecast is a more or less exact forecast of internal and external circumstances towards a person and society. But it is not a forecast predetermination of governance aimed at the person reacting to these circumstances. In other words, man can change the announced forecast by 180 degrees if he correctly estimates his inner state and external states, circumstances. Having the sense of measure, man can feel, sense his own matrix of possible states. Therefore, a forecast doesn't frighten him, but he takes it into account. If man completely trusts the forecast, or vice versa, he doesn't trust it at all, in this case, both of his reactions demonstrate his fear concerning this forecast, or his attitude towards it as an authoritative forecast, the forecast from an authoritative person. Both of these attitudes, reactions, in essence, demonstrate man's refusal of, predetermined by God, freedom of choice. Besides, man has willpower, savvist, and intellect in order to himself change his destiny. Now, let's talk about what makes a prophecy different from a forecast. Forecasts and prophecies are different by the source of origin. A forecast is a result of one's own individual effort. Before, I told you that one has to know statistics, past events, cause and effect relationships, possess the sense of measure, and so on. And then one can make a forecast of the future. A prophecy always comes from higher hierarchical levels, either from egregors of different types, or directly from God, and a person, a prophet, just announces this prophecy to others. Many of you have heard of such prophets as Muhammad, Buddha, Jesus Christ. The Bible speaks of many prophets, as does the Quran. There are also other known prophets such as Elijah, Moses, Solomon, Isaiah, and others. In this vein, let's talk about two prophets from the Bible. Mainly in the Bible, prophets are connected with Judea, Israel. People there were waiting for a Messiah that was expected to come and make their life happy. And prophets prophesied about this. Now I'm going to read two interesting prophecies, one from Solomon and the other one from Isaiah. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2. For the ungodly said, reasoning with themselves, but not aright, our life is short and tedious, and in the death of a man there is no remedy. Neither was there any man known to have returned from the grave. For we are born at all adventure, and we shall be hereafter as though we had never been. For the breath in our nostrils is a smoke, and a little spark in the moving of our heart. Which being extinguished, our body shall be turned into ashes, and our spirit shall vanish as the soft air. And our name shall be forgotten in time, and no man shall have our works in remembrance. And our life shall pass away as the trace of a cloud, and shall be dispersed as a mist that is driven away with the beams of the sun, and overcome with the heat thereof. For our time is a very shadow that passeth away, and after our end there is no returning, for it is fast sealed, so that no man cometh again. Come on, therefore, let us enjoy the good things that are present, and let us speedily use the creatures like as in youth. Let us fill ourselves with costly wine and ointments, and let no flower of the spring pass by us. Let us crown ourselves with rosebuds, before they be withered. Let none of us go without his part of our voluptuousness. Let us leave tokens of our joyfulness in every place. For this is our portion, and our lot is this. Let us oppress the poor righteous man. Let us not spare the widow, nor reverence the ancient gray hairs of the aged. Let our strength be the law of justice, for that which is feeble is found to be nothing worth. Therefore, let us lie in wait for the righteous, because he is not for our turn, and he is clean, contrary to our doings. He upbraideth us with our offending the law, and objected to our infamy, the transgressings of our education. He professeth to have the knowledge of God, and he calleth himself the child of the Lord. He was made to reprove our thoughts. He is grievous unto us, even to behold, for his life is not like other men's, his ways are of another fashion. We are esteemed of him as counterfeits. He abstaineth from our ways as from filthiness. He pronounceth the end of the just to be blessed, and maketh his boast that God is his Father. Let us see if his words be true, and let us prove what shall happen in the end of him. For if the just man be the Son of God, he will help him, and deliver him from the hand of his enemies. Let us examine him with despitefulness and torture, that we may know his meekness and prove his patience. Let us condemn him with a shameful death, for by his own saying he shall be respected. Such things they did imagine, and were deceived, for their own wickedness hath blinded them. As for the mysteries of God, they knew them not, neither hoped they for the wages of righteousness, nor discerned a reward for blameless souls. For God created man to be immortal, and made him to be an image of his own eternity. Nevertheless, through envy of the devil came death into the world, and they that do hold of his side do find it. Now, let's turn over a few pages in the Bible, and we come across Isaiah's prophecy. Who hath believed our message, and to whom hath the arm of Jehovah been revealed? For he grew up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form, no comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and Jehovah hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, yet when he was afflicted, he opened not his mouth, as a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and as a sheep that before its shearers is dumb. So he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. As for his generation, who among them considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due? And they made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased Jehovah to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Jehovah shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By the knowledge of himself shall my righteous servant justify many, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. I have just recited two prophecies. Now, let's talk about them. Wisdom of Solomon says that every person himself is responsible for his sins, and that God will not harm his messenger. Why would God betray and kill the one whom he has sent? As for the second prophecy, it is the other way around. It is as if God has sent his messenger to earth, so that this messenger shoulders other people's sins and dies a painful death. Now, I have a question for our viewers. Which prophecy do you think is from God, and which one is not from God? Do we ourselves have to be responsible for our sins? Or does one person have to be responsible for other people's sins? I think the answer is obvious. We ourselves have to be responsible for our own sins. Then a question arises. Are all of the prophecies set out in the Bible from God? Of course not. In order to prevent people in the Protestant West from raising relevant questions, Wisdom of Solomon is excluded from the Bible. This question is properly revealed in the work by the internal predictor of the USSR, An Anthem to Demonism, or a Gospel of Selfless Faith. This work properly reveals this question. As we've already touched upon the Bible, let's talk about the crucifixion of Jesus. I mean, did it really take place or not? Could God condemn his messenger to a painful death? In particular, the Quran Surah 4, ayats 157-158 say the following in this vein. And for their saying, we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the Son of Mary, the messenger of God. In fact, they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it appeared to them as if they did. Indeed, those who differ about him are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it, except the following of assumptions. Certainly, they did not kill him. Rather, God raised him up to himself. God is mighty and wise. Moreover, the novel by Mikhail Bulgakov, The Master and Margarita, culminates with a significant scene. The two of them are engaged in heated conversation, arguing about something and trying to reach some kind of agreement. "Gods, gods," says the man in the cloak as he turns his haughty face to his companion. "What a vulgar and banal execution, but please." Here his face turns from being haughty to imploring. "Tell me, it didn't really happen. I beg you, tell me. It didn't happen, did it?" "Of course it didn't happen," answers his companion in a hoarse voice. "You only imagined it." "And you can swear to that?" asks the man in the cloak in an ingratiating way. "I can," replies his companion, his eyes smiling for some reason. "I don't need anything else," cries out the man in the cloak in a broken voice, as he ascends higher and higher towards the moon, taking his companion with him. Walking behind them, calm and majestic, is a huge dog with pointed ears. You should pay attention to the fact that Bulgakov's father was a professor of theology. The novel The Master and Margarita is a significant novel, one novel that stands out among others and raises manifold questions of theology, in particular, this very question. What prophecies are from God and what prophecies are from egregors. The latter is most often satanic in essence. It is erroneous to regard every prophet as a true prophet, because he's named so. Look, what do we actually have? The whole history of mankind develops according to the matrix of Isaiah's prophecy. Who did Isaiah receive this prophecy from? From God or not? These are very serious matters, which become obvious and revealed if you properly know the sufficiently general theory of governance. What are the causes of given prophecies or forecasts? Before, I told you that prophets emerged mainly near the equator, in the Mediterranean Sea region, at the delta of the river Nile. Why? Because there were social tensions there. At the same time in Ras, there were no social tensions. Now, the situation is reversed. Where is the higher level of social tension? In Russia. Much of what was set out in the conception of social safety was received as revelations. Usually, people remember negative prophecies, forecasts, pre-warnings from above that came true. But people hardly ever remember favorable forecasts that came to be, so to say, programs of governance announced in advance. Why so? Because for governance, it is deviations that are of primary importance. As God gifted us with freedom of choice and will, we ourselves can make decisions. Every decision we make is inscribed either in God's design or in God's allowance. Imagine you are on a river with banks at both sides. If you move down the river, you will easily reach the goal. Meanwhile, the riverbanks symbolize trouble, obstacles, difficult ways of reaching the goal. The further from the river you are, the harder the way of reaching the goal is becoming. Oh, here is another image for you. There is an area of safe movement for reaching the goal with tailwind. But on both sides, or riverbanks, there exist obstacles with no tailwind. What's more, there are also headwinds, reefs, icebergs, and so on, the number of which is growing as you are distancing from the safe area with the tailwind. In both cases, you cannot go against God's will, and trespassing into God's allowance. Figuratively speaking, that area with icebergs is death. Deviations from the ideal course are important for God in the process of governance. If the nature of deviations exceeds the predetermined limits, allowances, and is on the edge of dangerous deviation in the future, the Creator shows His hand in this process. In particular, an example of God showing His hand is revelations, given to particular, singular people who could comprehend current processes in order to inform others on the meaning of the revelations. I should note again that a truly high-qualified ruler first has to pay attention to deviations from the ideal mode of the process flow of governance. I'd like to point to the fact that God is not a tyrant or a sadist. Therefore, forecasts and predictions, prophecies from God addressed to people contain information on a catastrophic or unfavorable future in the direction of which the present is developing, due to all that happened in the past and what is happening in the present. This is the essence of all prophecies. How should you react to a forecast? The first reaction to a forecast should be repentance. You should also review, re-evaluate the known past and intentions towards the future. There should be no reactions like ignoring forecasts, running from what is coming, like Oedipus from the Greek mythology, kicking against the pricks, that is, tempting God from your arrogant, disdainful, self-conceited position of "I know better, and nothing bad will happen to me." Not noticing a forecast, and other inadequate reactions. And these reactions contribute to the realization of a negative scenario. What is repentance? In the ordinary sense, most people associate it with certain religious rituals. When you have to come to a priest and confess to him your sins, the priest, in his turn, will plead your case, put in a word for you before God, and then he will say that God releases your sins. Russian writer Nikolai Leskov has such a story named Christ Bail, which tells us about a rich merchant. He works hard for a while, then he goes on a binge. He visits bars and restaurants, raising hell. After a while, he gets out of the state, goes to church, kneels, gives money to priests, repents, and the priests release him of his sins. Afterwards, he again becomes honest, modest, and works hard for a while. But then it all happens again. This is a ritual repentance. There are plenty of such rituals in religions. Now let's ask the question: is such a repentance needed? A repentance should be of an out-of-religion nature, when a person really ponders, reviews, re-evaluates his behavior, intentions for the future, and then, on the basis of the aforementioned actions, he follows renewed views in his psyche. He moves for the better, directing his thoughts, intentions, and deeds onto the dobrest and private path. If we consider these two types of repentance from the key concept of the sufficiently general theory of governance, stability in terms of predictability, we will see that ritual repentance is weakly stable in terms of its results, as can be seen in the example. True repentance is stable, the results of governance remain stable over time. A person should have the second type of repentance in relation to negative forecasts in terms of changing his views on his past actions and future intentions. One mustn't ignore forecasts like Nicholas II did, who didn't hit Grigory Yefimовich Rasputin, a messenger of the certain Russian clans. Rasputin warned Nicholas against entering World War I, telling him that this would bring Russia and Nicholas himself to perishment. Nicholas didn't take Rasputin's advice, a mistake which was followed by the revolution and other tragic ensuing events. The same thing happened to the Trojans, who didn't believe in Cassandra's pre-warning. But if they had heeded her and correlated their actions correctly according to her pre-warning, Troy would most probably still stand today, and most likely no one would remember her pre-warning today. As far as you see, it is destructive to ignore forecasts. The same concerns the Western society, in particular the catastrophe of the Titanic. In 1898, 14 years before the catastrophe, American writer Morgan Andrew Robertson published a book named The Wreck of the Titan. This story tells us about the catastrophe of the Titanic in all details, with almost the only difference being between the names. In the book, this liner is called the Titan. So, there was enough time in order to correlate what is set out in the book with the current processes associated with the Titanic in real life. Not noticing the forecast is also a reaction, but a specific one. In the Western society, they did notice the forecast due to their practical atheism, where there was no place for mystics in the society. But not noticing the forecast does not imply that it will not come true. As a result, this mysticism came true in real life, while practical atheists shrugged their shoulders. The Quran, Surah 13, Ayat 11, says the following: God does not change the condition of a people, until they change what is within themselves. This word formula from the Quran corresponds to the saying, God helps those who help themselves, or every man is the architect of his own fortune, or God is God, but don't be a clod. So the Quranic surah and these sayings tell us that we must take God's messages into consideration, comprehending them and taking them seriously. We must react to messages in a corresponding way and act consciously, utilizing all our powers of cognition. Ignoring or not noticing God's pre-warnings is practical atheism, in spite of the fact that a person can be ritually perfect within the boundaries of his religion. Reacting to God's pre-warnings through repenting, truly reconsidering views on the past and intentions for the future is, in its essence, out of confession, truly trusting God. Lying about the past means to classify as villains those who objectively did the wrong, or ascribing those who objectively did evil to the rank of the dobries. Such a deception regarding the past is inversely proportional to the impact on what is coming, the imminent. This is why everyone has to be careful when slandering Stalin's name, for instance, and praising Gorbachev. Stalin's teacher was George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, a mystic, philosopher, spiritual teacher, a forced migrant and composer of Armenian and Greek descent. He dedicated all his work to man's self-development, growth of consciousness, and being in daily life. His teaching among his followers was named the Fourth Way. Stalin worked from day till night. He knew accounting, 5 languages, all design engineers by name, many of whom were astonished by Stalin's deep knowledge of their subjects. Stalin was widely erudite and literate. On average, he read 500 pages a day, possessing the skill of speed reading. But today, those who haven't adequately read his works, haven't studied his biography, shout out, Stalin buried Gulag only. And the vast majority of people in the world actually know nothing about Stalin. But I'd like to know that today in Russia there are more and more people who are becoming interested in Stalin's life, and this process is escalating. There also exists the folk understanding of inviting disaster, which means programming a catastrophic future. A forecast pre-warning reduces the possibility of self-implementation. Meanwhile, inviting disaster increases the possibility of self-implementation. Being unable to adequately and correspondingly react to negative forecasts and empty concerns and fears, people themselves make trouble and difficulty for others, as well as themselves. Now, let's talk about passing skills of prediction and governance. Cause-effect objective patterns lie at the core of predictability and governance. And passing skills of prediction and governance is possible either in written or oral forms. When Christianity came to us, the Russian jretsys were eliminated, books were burned, and this is why such little information on our tragic history was preserved. As there was nobody who could pass the knowledge of Jret's nature, all skills were mainly lost. However, when passing the skills, there should exist a system of encoding information, that is to say, a language understandable for both sides. If this does not exist, one must oneself master the skill of prediction and governance. Mastering any skill is always an independent extension of one's system of stereotypes, through forming and introducing new stereotypes of internal and external behavior into one's system. Therefore, a mastery is work, which must be done personally by the one mastering. All the aforementioned corresponds to the saying: you can lead a horse to the water, but you cannot make it drink. You know, when we pass the information, many tell us, prove what you say. I should note that we do not prove anything, because the process of mastering is a process of subject image recognition, but not only work of memory and logic, that is abstract logical thinking. If a person has no images formed, to prove or not to prove to such a person is useless. If he has images, there is no need to prove anything to him. This person may have only fundamental questions concerning the core of the subject. However, the necessity of passing skills can require a new system of encoding, which is the conception of social safety. Therefore, those creating a new system of encoding have to ensure that it should be simple to master, it should not contain any distortions, it should correspond to the goal of tuition. It is when they teach a person one thing, but in the end he masters the opposite of what he has been taught. In these processes, the union of the objective and subjective instability in terms of predictability is also expressed. By the way, many complain that the texts in the conception of social safety are set out in a very difficult language. Why is this language difficult for many people? Because the conception of social safety contains a new terminological apparatus which everyone needs to master. How can one express the things we have already talked about? What class struggle, class conflict? There is no class conflict. With what do we need to replace this metrologically inconsistent term? We need new words. Why do we say that Stalin was a hostage of the terminological apparatus of Marxism? Because the fundamental words, concepts, were from Marxism. It was one of the reasons why there was no successor after Stalin. Stalin didn't have appropriate words, this lexical apparatus of the conception of social safety. But actually, he had the conception of social safety in the form of images in his mind. That is to say, he had the right views on what we discuss here. However, he couldn't vest it with appropriate words. He didn't possess such terms as the crowd elite system, vectors of goals, stability in terms of predictability, the entire function of governance, and so on. He couldn't express all this in words, as the terminological apparatus was of Marxism. This is why it is important to ensure that there are no distortions when passing skills of prediction and governance. By the way, those who disagree with the conception of social safety cannot refute or distort it. It is also important to avoid the following happening: when you learn one thing, but in the end you master the opposite. All these principles to avoid such things are embedded in the conception of social safety, in the KOB. Mark Mikhailovich Deitch, announcing his opinion on the book Dead Water in the newspaper Moskovsky Komsomolets, said approximately the following: it is impossible to retell, it is possible to quote only. Because the information is so dense that, figuratively speaking, you can't put a blade between the lines of this packed information. The information is accurately and properly substantiated. Accordingly, many of the statements are impossible to refute, because there is nothing that can be contradicted to that information. This is why the conception of social safety is hushed up. You will never come across this information in mass media, federal TV, radio, etc. I should also note that the KOB, the conception of social safety, does not contain any revolutionary discoveries. The fact is that many of the things set out in the conception of social safety were well known before, but were not systematically set out. Some positions are so unpleasant for people that they prefer not to think about them. This concerns the contradictions in the Bible, whether Jesus was crucified or not. This is why the conception of social safety contains the lexical forms, which precisely determine current processes, calling a spade without any reservations, misconceptions, or doubts. In its essence, the conception of social safety is a new system possessing a new lexical, terminological apparatus, which enables us to vest all these phenomena happening in our life with the exact measure of understanding. We have finished Lecture 9. In our next lecture, we will carry on discussing the basics of the sufficiently general theory of governance. See you next time.